In the last section, we created a new fetch image method right here. So the purpose of this method is going to be to make an HTTP request to that outside API, fetch the JSON for one image, and then create a new instance of the image model class out of it. But clearly, the first thing that we need to do inside of here is make an HTTP request. In order to make a request, we're going to import a new package into our app.dart file. So at the very top up here, I'm going to import a package, so package : called HTTP, and I want the http.dart file out of there. The HTTP package is installed into all new Flutter projects by default, so we don't have to do any additional installation. We can just import it directly into our project. Now inside of this HTTP package, which is maintained by the Dart team, we get a ton of different functions for making HTTP requests. The only function that you and I actually care about is a specific function called get. And the get function allows us to, as you might guess, make a get HTTP request. Let's very quickly look at some documentation around this package just to get a better idea of what's going on. Okay, so I'm at the documentation, which is at github.com/dart-lang/HTTP. So this is the GitHub repository for it. If you want to, you can visit it on dartlang.org or pub right here as well. And we can pull up some of the documentation over here if we wanted to. So on the right-hand side, you'll find API docs. We can go there, and it will pull up the documentation. So again, ton of functionality tied to this thing. Inside of specifically this HTTP library right here, that's inside of the HTTP package, on the right-hand side, you'll see that we get our list of functions. And so the only function we care about is the get function right here. We use this to make a request to some outside URL. So we can call the get function with some URL, and it's going to make the request. Now you'll notice that the return type, which is annotated to the left of the get word right here, is something called a future. We'll talk about what that is in just a moment. But first, I want to discuss one other little interesting thing about the import statement that we just wrote. So we just wrote out an import to grab every single class, every single function, every single property inside of the HTTP package and import it into our current working file. And as you can see over here, there is a tremendous amount of code, not only inside of HTTP right here, but potentially inside of those other libraries of browser client and testing that are part of the HTTP package as well. So when we write that one import statement, we are adding a ton of code into our project when actually you and I only care about this one function right here, just the get function. We don't care about anything else inside this package. So in order to avoid importing all those additional classes and all those additional functions, we can make a little change to our import statement. So up here, after the package name, I'm going to write out as, or excuse me, not as, but show get, like so. So by putting on show get right here, this means that this tells Dart, yeah, we understand HTTP has just like a billion different classes and functions tied to it, but out of all those, we only care about this one get function. So dump everything else inside there. We don't care about it. Just give us this one function. Okay, so that's just going to avoid us importing unnecessary code into our project. So now that we've got HTTP, let me try one more time. HTTP imported into our project, and we've got only the get function. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back to the next section and use that to make an actual request. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last section, we imported just the get function into our app.dart file. So now we're ready to use that get function to make a HTTP request over to that JSON API endpoint. Inside of my fetch image method right here, I'm going to call get. The first argument to the get function is the URL that we want to make our request to. To get that URL, I'm going to go back over to my browser where I still have the JSON placeholder.typebytecode.com URL inside of my address bar. So I'm going to copy this URL right here, and then I will put it in as the first argument to my get function as a string, like so. Now if we make a request to /photos, that's going to retrieve all 5,000 photos that are hosted at this API. And that's definitely not what we want to do. We only want to get one specific photo at a time. So to indicate which photo we want, I'm going to put a slash at the very end. Oops. Slash at the very end. There we go. And then we'll write out the ID of the photo that we want to fetch. So chances are that we want to start with the ID of 1, because that's the first photo there is inside this collection, and then get photo 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So for that, we can reuse the counter variable that we had previously created. Remember, we start off counter as 0, and then every time a user presses the button, we will increment that counter variable by 1. So I'm going to use a little bit of string interpolation here, and I'll put on counter at the very end. But you'll notice that anytime that counter is initialized inside of our appState class, it starts off as 0, and there is no photo with ID of 0. If we go back to that photos endpoint, the first photo inside the collection has an ID of 1. So I'm going to make sure that I don't try to get a photo with ID of 0 by just incrementing the counter variable by 1 right before we make that request. So we can absolutely increment counter by 1 by using the syntax right here. We could also write out simply counter plus plus, which has the same effect. Counter plus plus will increment the counter variable by 1. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, before we try to test out anything here, there's one thing I want to remind you about that I very briefly pointed out in the last section. If we go back over to the documentation for our get function, here is the get function. We pass in the URL as the first argument. You'll remember that I mentioned that the get function returns something called a future. So we need to have a quick discussion about what a future is, because it's a very important concept that's going to come up many, many times throughout all the other applications that we're going to build in this course. So we'll take a quick break, come back to the next section, and talk about what a future is.